All right, thanking God again for functional, practical wisdom. Let's call Mark chapter 4 great responses as Jesus is going to continue to teach in parables in many ways as a response to the increasing resistance from parts of the crowd, specifically the scribes, won't be the chief priests yet, Pharisees, etc. Understanding that, sometimes I'll use the term Pharisees as kind of just a general term for the growing opposition, understanding that they are, or at least they tend to be, the more famous wing of that growing opposition. It's not always them, though, and I try to make the distinction to make that clear. But understanding all of that, chapter 4 is a continuation of chapter 3's introduction of parables as a form of teaching that helped me, God willing, I think to see, at least at this point, the way in which he is growing or building barriers, healthy boundaries without shutting everyone out. The parables are going to seem to still provide people access without giving them too much access, understanding that some of the access is coming with, or some of those who are approaching him are coming with unhealthy motives. And as we saw in chapter 3, Mark chapter 4 is going to largely mirror a single chapter of Matthew, that being Matthew chapter 3, where he gives the purpose of parables. He's going to do the same thing in Mark, where he's going to give them the parable of the sower in verses 1 through 9, explaining the purpose of parables in verses 10 through 12, going on to explain the parable of the sower in verses 10 through 20. Understanding that, we've heard this before, I just want to give a few highlights that I might not have mentioned before. That being in the first section where he gives the purpose of parables, one of our brothers mentioned as we went through Matthew, one of the recurring phrases, a famous phrase from Jesus is, "He who has ears to hear, let him hear." One of the reasons why it caught my attention that he is not simply trying to confuse the crowds as much as he's literally going to say that is part of what he's doing with Isaiah's prophecies, but it's going to connect to something that we see later in the chapter when in verse 33, he's going to say, "With many such parables, he spoke the word to them as they were able to hear it." And so if he wanted to simply shut them out, he could have overwhelmed them with the teaching. One of the things that get convicted about, trying not to say too much, because it has the effect of shutting down the ability to even perceive, when retention is a lot of ways what matters, as he is going to go on to say in the second section, like we said, where he gives them the purpose of parables. No, he really is trying to shut out those who, for whatever reason, aren't coming to him with the healthiest of motives. How do we know? Well, the famous explanation of the parable of the seeds explains just that. And the nuance that I didn't emphasize last time, I think, is in verse 20, where he's going to say, "But those that were sown on the good soil are the ones who hear the word and accept it and bear fruit, 30-fold and 60-fold and 100-fold, helping us to understand that retention is key. Understanding that it's not just hearing and accepting that's huge, because that's the division we're seeing in the crowd. But as we said, it's the difference between the mere optimism of seeing the glass half full, accepting Jesus for his potential and being inspired by it, and beyond the inspiration, which we're going to see two types of soil seem to be inspired: the rocky soil that immediately springs up and seems to have the potential of bearing some fruit, but it proves unfruitful because it immediately falls away, or just as immediately falls away when tough times hit. But there's a time distinction, because even though there's an immediate rejection of the word in the seed sown along the path, there's an immediate falling away when the rocky soil shows potential, but it immediately falls away in difficulty. There's more of a delayed reaction in the thorny soil, where it seems to take some time, but the interest in other things ultimately proves over time to make the word unfruitful. And then the good soil over time proves that it is not only accepted what it's heard, but it's done something with it. And so that's the distinction. Understanding that it's important not to overwhelm a willing ear, but to possibly understand the ways in which over time it proves productive. Going on, he'll go on and get a few of the other parables that we saw back in Matthew 12, but not all of them. Understanding that in verses 21 through 25, he is going to give us the lamp under the basket. That is the one that we, at least I think, saw back in the Sermon on the Mount. That would have been Matthew chapter 5, but dividing it up, Matthew 24 through 25, or verses 24 and 20, no, sorry, Mark 24 and 25 in this chapter are going to shift gears and talk about the way in which it is important to pay attention to what they have heard, because as he said in another portion of Matthew, to the one who has and has been productive, more will be given. But to the one who is proven unproductive in their hearing, even what they have will be taken away. Going on in verses 26 through 29, he's going to talk about timing, understanding that this is one that I do not believe appears in Matthew 12 or maybe in Matthew at all. He's going to talk about the way that seed is sown. We don't necessarily understand the specifics of how the earth gives produce, but we do understand that when the produce is there, it's important to go ahead and harvest, because the produce or the productivity isn't going to last forever. Left on the vine, it can just rot, be eaten, all kinds of things that make it essential to understand timing in productivity. Likewise, in verses 30 through 32, he's going to talk about the parable of the mustard seed, one that we did see back in Matthew 12, seeming to make it clear that the kingdom of God is likened unto small things or even individuals who God can use to provide for many. The mustard seed, talking about a small thing that provides shelter for many, talking about the way in which a large tree can provide shelter for many birds. Back in Matthew 12, he talked about the parable, he gave the parable of the leaven, talking about the way that very little or a small amount of one thing can provide food for many, or at least far in excess of its actual size, or out of proportion to its actual size in a good way. As verses 33 through 34 back here in Mark 4 are going to, as we mentioned, say that as they were able to hear it, he gave them additional words, but he did not speak to them without a parable, but privately to his own disciples, he explained everything, concluding that even though they had additional access to the Christ, they still were not perfected. That was going to be a process. As final section, verses 35 through the end of the chapter, verse 41, are going to recount the story of them being caught in the storm in the boat with Christ, him sleeping in the hull, I believe, waking him up as they are terrified. But he asks them, do you still have this little faith? Or I butchered that. What does it actually say? Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? As he is going to calm the winds, as they are going to observe or marvel, who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? However, the thing that probably most caught my attention about this chapter is, as we mentioned, the way in which we see Christ wise in establishing boundaries without shutting everyone out, understanding that the productivity of the seed sown in the parable of the sower was proven over time, meaning kind of like we see in Hebrews chapter 11, as I like to quote it from the New King James Version. I think it's verse 6. It says, he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. And even though his apostles were getting the immediate explanation, understand that after his crucifixion, they were going to continue teaching. And quite possibly those that they were going to find effective hearers were those who had actively done the best they could with what they were taught until, as verse 33 says, they were able to hear and, more importantly, be effective with hearing more of the truth. Never, as a brother mentioned in one of our Wednesdays not too long ago, never speaking half truth to people, but speaking the whole truth to people in doses that they can effectively put to work. Which is why we sometimes say, my prayer for you is my prayer for me. God, please help us to never neglect the wisdom that you're giving us in the doses that you know that we can handle, so that we can be ready for the next time you offer us a portion of wisdom or counsel that can functionally bless our lives. And not just us, but the people you have put us here to be a blessing to.